Hello and welcome to Sounds Heal Podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Brown, and thank you so much for joining me as we continue to explore the fields of sound healing, sound therapy, and generally the use of sound for health and wellness. Today, our guest is Dr. John Beaulieu, a composer, musician, psychologist, naturopathic physician, and tuning fork innovator. Dr. Beaulieu has been a leader in the field of sound healing for 50 years. He teaches internationally, and I have to say, is very generous with his teaching and how he shares his perspectives. I have had him on this podcast once before, and I'll drop the link to that episode in the show notes wherever you're listening or watching, as that does give us a lot of insight into his background and everything that's led him to where he is now. I reached out to him to join us again because of this upcoming class that he'll be teaching, a 7-week immersion, sound, still point, and fuzzy logic. I was really curious about what all that means. And I think in this conversation, you're going to find this beautiful balance of science, intuition, art, and the unknown when we have this discussion about what all this means. And in this conversation, as well as in his class, you're going to learn to access gateways through sound and through still point, through language that can help you inspire creativity, clarity, and transformation. So thanks for being with us. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. John Beaulieu. If you're interested in the class that we talk about, I will drop the link to sound, still point, and fuzzy logic class in the show notes. This podcast is sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa, located in Sarasota, Florida, and online at theomshop.com. If you're looking for that special tool, if you're looking to up-level your sound healing practitioner instruments, the Om Shop has such a variety, many custom instruments, and they can really offer a lot of advice if you're looking for something specific. They also have a luxury spa and trainings, workshops, if you're able to make it there in person. Thanks so much to the Om Shop for their support and sponsorship. Please enjoy this episode with Dr. John Beaulieu. All right, John, wonderful to have you back on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, so you have a class coming up, and that was really why I reached out, is because of even just the topic name, sound, still point, and fuzzy logic. So to ask the first question might actually be a bit fuzzy,
Yep.
because the quality of the question can be fuzzy. What is fuzzy logic? What do we mean by that?
Well, fuzzy logic is the way we live, actually. We have this thought when we quantify something that's precise. And there is no, and we have the idea that science proves something that is precise. but my background is very strongly in both science and the arts. One thing we learned in science right away is that science doesn't prove anything. It suggests, but it doesn't prove. And every research paper has a degree of error. It's fuzzy. Now, scientists will argue. I remember I had an argument when I was doing the biochemical research on the tuning forks. The scientist who was in charge, the biochemist in charge, had a problem with his wife, and he said he needs a relationship counselor. And he said, but he doesn't trust them because their degree of error is too high, but his degree of error is better. So I said, well, people aren't, test tubes. I mean, it's a matter of perspective and how much fuzzy you want to deal with. So fuzzy logic is the basis of AI. It's the basis of how your iPhone works, how you take pictures. It's the basis of how most everything in the world is functioning today. It's the basis of artificial intelligence. So we ask ourselves, we mostly think in binary terms. It's hot or it's cold. It's true or it's false. And that's basically in cognitive behavioral therapy, that's the gateway to depression. When you think, and we call dichotomous things, I'm all bad or I'm all good. I messed this up completely. In other words, there's no longer any room for nuances, for shades of gray, for shades and so on. But purely from a scientific, from just an everyday perspective, if you have water, it's not completely hot or completely cold. There's a trillion variations between hot, absolutely hot, and absolutely cold. So artificial intelligence says, how can we get the computer to recognize those variations and modify them based on instructions for like your house with your thermometer. You know, it says, okay, it senses, it's got a sensor that says 72 degrees. You say, would I like it at 72.5? Right? So that's fuzzy. So it's either 72 or 73, but fuzzy, if you get good enough with your sensors, it can be 72.56121. It just depends on where you want to locate your fuzzy consciousness, right?
Right. I mean, I was about to ask, is there anything really that is not fuzzy? Is there
No,
anything that is that precise and
zero,
perfect?
absolute. The only thing not fuzzy would be absolute zero.
Yeah.
The moment you, which would be, we say still point, right? That's where the word we say still point, or you could call it a node in music, you could call it absolute zero in physics and so on. But there, and that's an ideal, it doesn't exist for the most part, because the moment you observe absolute zero, it's no longer absolute zero, your observation changes it and it becomes fuzzy. So if you picture here zero and everything coming out like a wave in all directions is going to have fuzzy. So you say, like in sound, for example, how you have a note C and you have a note C sharp, how many tones are between C and C sharp? Infinite. You know, and so it's the fuzziness of it is what gives us life. Uh, so the more, when I first, remember I first taught in Germany, they were all worried that the aluminum tuning forks vary just they vary a little bit. They're fuzzy, which I wanted. I want fuzzy, not too a general fuzziness. Where steel is perfect. I said, yes, steel isn't perfect. You have to have, you could have little tuning forks this little, so small you could hardly see them. They're made of crystals and they're activated by lasers, and they're fuzzy, right? So there's always a degree of fuzziness that's present. And recently they've come out with research on people's enjoyment of music and so on. And it's showing that when people prefer that music, if it's perfectly in tune, they don't like it. They want instruments that vary and so on like that. So we're always looking, we're kind of like obsessive compulsive people looking for the perfect note, you know? And we need to become more fuzzy people. And so the still point is just a way of accessing parts of our brain that allow us to open up to the fuzziness that we have built into us.
I was just thinking, as an orchestral musician, of course, the ideal is to be perfectly in tune. But if you have, you know, 10 to 100 violinists playing at the same time, it's, and
Yeah.
I think maybe that's what I like about music is the fuzziness, actually.
Well, that's what
Uh,
the research is showing. That's what people want. You know,
yeah.
they like the Balinese music and things like that. When you listen to it, we listen to the old Western music with they didn't have any tuning forks to tune to. They just get something together and it'd be all kinds of stuff going on, and they like the variation. My favorite story I tell in fuzziness, that when I thought, with music school, I remember I was sitting in the back of the auditorium at Indiana University waiting for, the pianist to come out and play, Rudolf Serkin. He was a Beethoven specialist. And so I was all by myself except for listening to the piano tuner. And the piano tuner was, you know how they go, the blah, 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 like that. I'm going to sleep because I'm a good student. I know how to sleep at the right moments in the right darkness. So I'm sitting there in the back of the auditorium. Nobody knows I'm there. And the piano tuner's putting me to sleep. And all of a sudden I hear, bum, like a Beethoven chord. And it was different. It just shot through me. My eyes pop open and there's Rudolf Serkin with the tuner. And he's playing some Beethoven a little bit. And then he starts looking at the tuner, he looks at the piano and starts banging on it. It's like bam, 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 bam. And then the tuner is this, like, you can imagine, he's livid. He's like, his whole world's falling apart. What are you doing to my perfectly tuned piano? And Rudolf Serkin looked at him. He says, there's nothing more boring in the world to an audience than a perfectly tuned piano, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings me back to what you were saying about AI, artificial intelligence as well. Now you could type in a few keywords and actually get a full song that could be released on the radio.
Of
But
course,
what's missing though? What's missing is expression, heart,
art,
emotion, you know.
emotion.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, we'll see that as human beings, the question is, if we look at it from a computer perspective, it's very, it needs sensors, it works, it acts like a human being, it can do unbelievable things. But there's something, and it can do those things, and it actually frees us up to do other things, right? It also points out to some of the challenges of the progression of music, for example. Anybody can sit around and make a pop tune with AI, it's interesting, and so you say, why are we doing that? Why are we wasting our time in that, right? Anybody can have. Now I love AI therapy, where you can actually bond to an AI, and you get therapy. There's all kinds of research being done on how therapists would talk, and it's really good. But then they say, what does that free us up to do? That's my big question is, now I'm not bound by, I have to play harmony in a certain way, or I have to, what's left?
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think just coming down to the question, the quality of the question, and fuzzy logic, it wouldn't matter what you type into Google or Chat GPT or whatever it is. The answer is still fuzzy.
It's always fuzzy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if there's no way we can get, like, I use AI with Microsoft Word because I like it. It's actually, I've written books and I've worked with a lot of editors. The AI is better than most of the editors I've worked with. And I really do have I talk with it. I can talk, I can talk, but I find it easier that the AI I like it because it doesn't have an agenda about my work, whereas the editors did. Right, so and it frees me up in ways, so I like to say I love my AI, but it opens me up to new possibilities.
Well, how can we use fuzzy logic in our life or when there's uncertainty, perhaps?
Yeah, well, there's uncertainty all the time, right? So it's really the question that, especially in class, I want people to get a skill set, a really lifelong skill set that I've used constantly for God knows how many years. I've developed it, I've used it in therapy and so on. But I don't mean it to be, if somebody, obviously, we have like two sides of physics. We got a quantum physics and a classical physics. You need both. If I'm crossing a bridge, I hope a classical physicist designed it, right? And so on. So it's the same thing when we come to human beings and what's happening now. Some people really do need good therapy, real classical therapy. They need to be watched, they need to be taken care of. But there's this other thing that's going on that I want to teach that could be integrated with that, but you don't need to. People could use it all the time. How do you use fuzzy in your life to your advantage? And it's, how do you accept it? How do you relate to it? And how do you capitalize on it? How do you open doors with it? How do you see that fuzziness can give you new possibilities that perhaps you haven't imagined if you relate with it correctly, versus judging yourself, going into depression or whatever, or being upset that life is fuzzy. So this whole point is to have tools, and sound has been used as a tool with fuzzy logic for thousands of years. It's just not used those terms. And then we want to use more modern terms. We want to map it into quantum, what we call quantum neurology, so that we have this real clear picture that transcends the different cultural approaches, that gives us a neutral scientific way of looking at it, that we could say, hey, I love shamanism, but let me take this and then do the shamanism, but not make it like the shamanism is the only way to do it. Right? So I love Vedanta. Great, but let's look at some common universal principle between shamanism, Vedanta, AI, and so on. And how can we then use that to be more flexible in the way that we treat ourselves?
Right. And, it seems that if we fight against fuzziness, right, there always has to be the right answer, the right decision in life that can cause a lot of issues, like you said, depression, kind of separation, um, and perhaps maybe is the root of some of these thought patterns that we can get stuck on, these belief systems that we're in a loop.
Yeah, we get caught in belief systems, and we get caught in that somebody did it better than us, or the way to do it is this is the only way to do it, as they did it like in a yoga practice. It says, my favorite was years ago. I ran across, went all over India with mantras and bija mantras and looking for the right pronunciation. This was when I was in my 20s. And every place I went, they had the right pronunciation. And so then finally I got to someone who was a fuzzy logic guru, and he said, no, the pronunciation, and I began to compare it with comic books, that if you look at the comic books and our kids flying an airplane, what's the right pronunciation to fly the airplane? I mean, but this comes from the heart, from here, and they just do it. And the guru was telling me, that's really just, you're tuned in, and it just comes out. And that's the right pronunciation at that time, in that moment, and so on. But there is no like tuning like that for the mantra.
Yeah. Well, let's bring that to sound a bit. Of course, one of the parts of your course title even is still point, which you've mentioned, but how can we use sound to access that still point, and how does it affect our body and mind?
Well, the sound, we're also seeing through science, it deactivates, the word deactivate, the science word is down regulates basically what's called the default mode network. It's a part of your brain, and also what we call the prefrontal dorsal cortex. So when that happens, really you're going still point. The other word for that, by the way, is, I don't like to use it, but it's a historic word, you go into trance, right? But the word trance, unfortunately, has many meanings in the West. When I was in India, I was with a family, and the daughter came home and said, I went to temple and I went into trance. And the parents were like, well, what did you get? What did you learn? What was it like? If I said that to my parents, they would have said, go to the psychiatric hospital. But trance is just the neutral state, still neutral. Another word for still point is neutral, right? So the sound has the ability, when we mindfully listen, deep listen, it will take us it will deactivate or downregulate parts of our brain that now gives us access to our whole brain, right? And so we have access to distant sites, all kinds of networks that we wouldn't have access to. The same thing happens, by the way, when you take a psychedelic. There's no difference, right? Except for the fact you don't have a plant medicine in you. You're not bound by that. The sound is used for enlightenment for, forever. It's very powerful, but when you know how to use it. So now I personally, I use tuning forks, which are so very neutral, but you could use shaman drums, you could use Peruvian whistles, you could use your flutes, you could use whatever. It's a matter of how the person listens. And when the sound is a little fuzzy and they're neutral, they're not bound by it, all of a sudden these parts of your brain neural system deactivate, and you're open to all kinds of new ideas. So, but when they deactivate, it's in psychedelic medicine, it's called set and setting, right? So the set is, and when I'm going to teach, is what's going on with you. What's challenge in your life do you want to deal with? That's the set. And the setting is just that you're safe. So now when you go in with the right language, with that set, and you deactivate the prefrontal cortex, and you have access to all sorts of distant sites, what I'm going to call microtubule neural storage units in your brain, which, you have all this unbelievable amount of information that you have access to. It's like Google. It's the same thing as on the computer. I don't know. Let me put a word in it, see what I get. But it's no different, but it's a human way of doing it.
Yeah, and I like what you said about tuning forks being neutral. I think that is the case for most people. I would say sometimes musicians, when you bring the tuning forks to the ears, they're like, "Oh, that's a fifth, right? That's maybe they
Yes.
have perfect pitch." So in a way, I like that you're incorporating Fibonacci tuning forks not only into your work, but it seems like it's mentioned in your upcoming course because even for musicians, that starts to get fuzzy as you go into
Yep.
the series. For anybody that doesn't know what that is, can you mention a little bit about the Fibonacci
The
series?
Fibonacci
Yeah.
series is us. Basically, when you walk through nature, every leaf that you see, everything around us is Fibonacci. Our ears are Fibonacci, the internal organs, our brain, the way it's structured, the way our face moves, everything about us is based on it could be related to a mathematical series developed by Italian mathematician Fibonacci. So that series, I don't like to do numbers, but but basically, if you look at the shape of your ears or a seashell, or just the way that things branch on a leaf, that's the way your neural systems work. That's the way we are. So I like sound that's, we say, tuned to the Fibonacci series. As it turns out, if we were to take in normal music, we have like a C and a G, right? That's Fibonacci. That's the gateway right there to what creates a beautiful spiral, uh, and a growth spiral, the way that babies grow in the womb. They start with C and G. So that's why I call it human tuning and not music tuning, right? And right, so to me, there's a huge difference. So we have this simple C and G. It's also the basis of music tuning, which is even more interesting. But from human tuning standpoint, the Fibonacci series is in our brain, in our what we call our neurons. And if I hold up this little tube, we have in our brain, in the neuronal cells, there's a skeletons that hold them together called cytoskeletons. And inside are thousands of each, billions of these all together in our brain. Tubes. They're called microtubes, and they're hard. And can you imagine, if you look at this little tube here, it said what makes it, it's flexible, but it's got all sorts of little circles on it. And that in the microtubules of your neurons, those little circles would be crystals. Right? These are called tubulin proteins, but the tubulin proteins acts as a crystal lattice that forms the skeleton of your neural system. And so you got hundreds and thousands of crystals, and you got trillions and trillions in your brain. And each crystal, it's said by the scientists, but this is by Hameroff and Penrose, has more memory power than all the hard drives in the world. And you're talking about trillions of them. In mysticism, we say the Akashic records, what they talk about in yoga, was probably right here. Who knows what's in all these crystals. So the question is, how do you access this storage? And how far does it go? Is it this? Because a lot of times in normal classical therapy, we get caught in, here's the problems of my daily life. We don't think I'm a vibrational being living in a quantum universe or anything like that. And I have access to 14,000 dimensions and memories that go back infinitely. We don't stop and think about that. We think about what can I do right away to solve my problem. And unfortunately, we don't think very far. We just go get some alcohol or stone ourselves or whatever. And go, okay, I numbed it. That's good enough for me. But we have access to this. This is us. And these are mapped together. And when we're coherent and we go in, then we use the right language and the right sound. And the sound we want is Fibonacci. And it turns out that these crystals fire and are accessed through Fibonacci codes. Yeah, so that's the class right there. We need to have stillness, trance, basically. We go in, we have to write language, in a way, Google all this, and we need to learn how to recognize the results that we're getting. And I do this 24 hours a day. I can't imagine not doing it whenever something's challenging. But again, for class, I don't mean this as a substitute for someone who really needs to have good care. But they may not need to have that care if they learn this early on. That's the point.
Right. Yeah, it's an alternative. And I know specifically with Fibonacci, you've worked with people with dependencies,
Yes.
addictions, right? It's an alternative to get to those altered states that fix in a way.
Yeah, when I do that, remember, I'm integrating that as a doctor, into my therapeutic practice. That's when you put both together, right? And the reason I found it so powerful was I saw the result I've worked with thousands of patients. I would just do a normal session. Here's what's expected to be by my license. And I would say, okay, I've got 5 minutes, 6 minutes at the end, at the beginning. Let me tap the forks, give you some what we call good words, some fuzzy logic words. And I began seeing results that were off the charts for me. I mean, it's amazing what would happen. And then I began gradually bringing it out and seeing it outside of my professional context and saying, wait a minute, it works so well, we keep using it in my life. You know, so I want to bring that for everybody. And then for sound healers, it works really well because you don't have to be trained in psychotherapy. And in fact, I train people to stay out of psychotherapy. It's better. You don't need to go into everybody's stuff and stir it up because if you don't know what you're doing, that's not a good thing. In fact, you could learn not to go into your own stuff and stir it up. It's probably really good too.
Yeah, I know that there's practitioners that are actually trying to find a different way in than talk therapy, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I was wondering, as sound healing practitioners that listen to this podcast, and the field itself, there can definitely be um, people that are looking at this in a non-fuzzy way. They're looking for that frequency
Right.
there's this one
Yep.
frequency for this.
Yep.
How can we embrace more fuzziness in the sound healing field?
Well, I think this by talking about it, and because underneath of, say, wanting there to be the magic frequency is kind of like magical thinking, utopic thinking. Uh, and I like to say that what makes human beings special is their ability to adapt to change, right? So the fuzziness is our ability to constantly adapt. And we probably have those when we do adapt, we think that we're successful, we want to keep it. Uh, like I like to say to everybody, hope you're enlightened for 1 minute every day. I'd be very happy. But once you get enlightened in a way, and you try to keep it, it's gone, right? So we actually, in psychology, we call it now flow psychology, that you want to stay in the flow, like an athlete wants to stay in the flow. But we know at any moment you can get knocked out. And my thing is it isn't so much when you're in the flow, you're just in the flow. But when you get knocked out, then you need to know what to do versus going into beating yourself or judging yourself. Like if an athlete hits it I play golf, so if I watch a golfer in the flow hit a bad shot, if they're an amateur, they just get more and more out of flow because they beat themselves up. What did I do? And I watch the professionals I play with, they hit a bad shot. They take a deep breath, relax, and they go right back into flow. They know how to treat themselves. When people do it, instead of learning what to do, they just beat themselves up more. They made me a lot of money in my practice over the years, but I don't want them to do that. It's too much work now. I want people to know how to get back into flow. You don't always need professional help to do that. And sound healing, by the way, is one of the best ways to do that, as long as you accept what the limitations of the field are, and you learn how to use it every day in your life, not just doing it with other people.
Right, make it a practice. Yeah, and that's right, that the ability to redirect yourself when you're out of the flow isn't as easy as it sounds, right? Our thoughts, analytical mind can really take over.
Well, it's guaranteed.
Yeah.
Our emotions take over, analytical mind takes over, or whatever. And it's guaranteed, as far as I know, that in the future, you're going to get knocked out of flow. You know, it's been that way for beginning, as far as I know, in all history, forever. And if you're looking, every time, every generation looks for the ideal state of harmony forever, which to me was probably the most boring thing in the world. So I mean, I'm in tune, I'm in tune, I'm in tune. Well, no, when you're in tune, it's when I'm in tune, I'm in tune, I'm out of tune. Wow, let me appreciate that, because that's going to be a little fuzzy. And it's interesting, each one of those little fuzzy states is another universe. It's called the many worlds theories of quantum, right? So now all of a sudden, you're not out of tune, you're just in tune with a new place. Right? And when you can use that, you have access to other multiple dimensions. And maybe this conflict came in your life to help you open up to all these new possibilities and dimensions. And in India, they say that Shiva visited you, right? So, yeah, now all of a sudden, wait a minute, even though it looks terrible from one perspective, if I can just sit with the frequency, get past my judgments of myself, get past my emotions, just sit with we call it the feeling tone in psychology, and meditate on it, then, and be in tune with it, because the harmony means to join together with, right? And take it out of the normal musical model of harmony, then we could discover a much larger musical universe with all kinds of, for instance, we thought if you play C and F sharp, that was the devil's tone at one point, right? It was horrible, and people were executed for it, right? And put in jail and stuff like that, and called witches, and it goes on and on and on. This for playing the wrong note, right? And now, thanks to, I play a piano piece called Liszt Dante Sonata, and it's all based on F sharp and what's called an augmented fourth in music. And people came from everywhere to listen to it and fell in love with it. And the same thing with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which was the devil's music, and now all of a sudden it's in opera houses and people think it's a beautiful music composition. That's the openness of learning all kinds of things that are ugly, that think we judge, that all we can just get to the frequency of it, we'll find in there a new music.
Wow, that's beautifully said. I mean, just to embrace and not fight what we might label as dissonance, or let's say somebody's using a leaf blower outside, or the cement trucks going by, and how annoying, but is it really? I mean, just, it's a label, it's a choice how we react to things in a way.
Well, it's how we relate to it. And all we can control is our relationship with. So the truck can go by and I could be mad, pissed off, and scream and write letters to the city and stuff like that, which maybe is all right. I prefer it didn't go by, but if it did go by, I'd rather get the most out of it.
Yeah. No, I really like that, just to, that there can be beauty and blurriness and
Yeah.
fuzziness. And, sometimes that might feel chaotic in our lives, but there's a reason it's there for us to kind of shine the light on something that
Well,
we do need to.
we
Yeah.
have an interesting, I think we share both an appreciation of music, so especially, I'm a classically trained pianist. I find that Bach, I have friends that could only play Bach, I mean, we're dealing with such beauty, and beauty is just, like I'm playing Scriab, I don't know if it's Scriabin, but I'm playing Scriabin's Fifth Sonata, and I just fall in love with it, but at the same time, it can be, in a way, limiting. Beauty can blind us, and music has been, in the West especially, you go from, like we say, we went from Stravinsky's being the devil's music to good music. But in most of our music schools, they stopped teaching music basically in 1910. You don't have, you give lip service to John Cage or Stockhausen or John Cage was my mentor, Zanakis, my mentor, Schoenberg, who just said, wait a minute, let's just codify the keyboard, make it backwards, forwards, upside down. I got none of that, or very little of it. But when I first heard John Cage's HPS CD, I fell in love with it. And I said, what's going on here? But he's saying that all sounds are music, not just this particular keyboard or this, like we have 8 and 12 chromatic sounds, and they did have 22. And in India, they hate the piano because it's so rigid, but again, when we get into world music, we have all kinds of possibilities from didgeridoos to, our ears begin to expand. Shamanism expands their ears. They're into all kinds of sounds that necessarily aren't Western music. In fact, rock and roll, the blues used to be the devil's music.
Yeah, and
quite a
bit of rock and roll actually
Yeah,
was
in music,
labeled as.
we have a lot of devils in music.
Yeah, that's right.
We have
That's
a lot
right.
of beauty and a lot of devils, right?
And how that viewpoint changes over time, how it's accepted. It's so interesting.
Constantly changing.
Yeah.
It's just, but I want to take it further. I'm very interested as a composer in mathematics, which is Wozniacki's. I did a lot of mathematics and sound, because sound is math, sound is numbers. And how do you take modern science mathematics, topology, fuzzy logic, set theory, and so on, and map that into consciousness and how we listen, versus how we're taking some from the 18th century, the 17th century. Everything changed. It's interesting, everything in physics changed and everything in music changed at the entryway into the 20th century. And music schools are still back in the 19th century. They're except for they teach jazz, which is still 19th century harmony when it comes down to it, closer to raga, but there's something else going on. And I'm interested in that, not just because it's music, but because when it's used properly, it becomes healing. Yep.
Absolutely. And to bring it to maybe just a practical, for people that are involved in sound and just starting to gather what this fuzziness means, what is just something simple that you could do to kind of lean into this, whether it's a sound practice or just fuzzy language?
Well, I think it's the simple thing is this: you can tap 2 tuning forks, right? Which or I have recordings. They're free of recordings in my Bandcamp, or you could just have 2 tuning C and G. That's it. And when I say with tuning forks, all we need is C and G, right? Right? And you can just learn to tap on your knee, or you just tap together, and you move your body, and it's making all these sounds that are bouncing, creating a field that has within it a shimmering that's harmonically tuned, which means there's one note, every note you hear is tuned with it, right? And it goes up and it opens up both the Fibonacci spiral and a harmonic stairway, right? And when you do this and just say to yourself, I want to open myself up to new possibilities. That's it. I want to create new ideas. You can just say, or you have a problem, you say, I want to create new possibilities for solving this problem that perhaps I haven't thought of. That's the fuzzy language. But we don't make it like this is the answer, right? Because the moment you do that, it's like how could you do it? Because you don't even know, but you do know in a way when you have access to what we call the neural net, right? And now you have access to, we could philosophically discuss how deep it goes and how many dimensions are there. Many physicists think that it goes multiple dimensions of this knowledge that we have. So we now can use a simple method to access and treat ourselves correctly beyond judgments. Just tap. You can move your body, or just tap, meditate, and just you say, I open myself to new possibilities. Period.
Right. Anything more specific would be restricting, would be limiting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can, in a way, you can be vaguely more specific. I want to teach people how to be vaguely more specific, but then how do the other thing is, how do you recognize the information that's coming to you, like when you do a Google search and so on. So Carl Jung would call that synchronicity. Things show up, but you have to know what you're looking for to recognize them. And I call that I call it values clarification, that you now clarify that what is now beginning to come into not just my thought patterns, but things show up. How do you begin to see them, to recognize them? That's so when you do a Google search, you relate it to what you search for, right? So you say, and you go, oh, that doesn't have to do with something catches you, and you go, wow, yes, I like that, right? So we learned how to recognize somatic signaling, intuitive signaling, intellectual signaling, to identify the results of what we've done, or we just trust it, we just go with it, and things show up.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to that setting and method that you talked about, that the set is obviously the intention in a way,
Yep.
but also starting from that still point, right? You kind of have to get
You
to
have
that
to have
open,
the
receptive space to be open to the possibilities and whatever information you're going
Well,
to
because you have
be.
to downregulate the neural networks that get in the way, right? So, and we can do it with sound, or like I say, if you take some psilocybin, it'll do it too. But the question is always, how are you going in and opening this doorway? That's if you do it in a bad environment, it's called a bad trip, with the right words. I think the early jazz musicians and stuff would sit and they would do it, but they would do it in an environment they were using it, a lot of them, to escape. So they'd have to have drugs and stuff like that. They didn't understand the power of what they were into. Uh, so they would get the words they say to themselves, the environments that you're doing it in makes a big difference, the setting.
Yeah, I can see how this approach, this fuzzy approach, just could be really good for creativity, for getting unstuck
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
on things as well.
absolutely. I mean, and and like I say, it's not something I'm teaching that I don't do. I live it, literally, I live it. I can't imagine that if something, when I get in the shower, I love to like hum and turn on the cold water. But before I turn on the cold water, I go, and I'm going to focus on all kinds of new possibilities for the tomorrow morning to put them together, new ideas, new ways of seeing things. And I tune up. Yes, go, boom, hit the cold water, right? That's different than going into cold water. It's, I'm a bad person. I don't know.
Right. Well, wonderful. I guess just last topic or last question for you. Um, what, just an update. What are you curious about right now? Research, new book. What are the possibilities that you're open to right now?
Well, remember, for me, the healing part starts very simple, CNG. I don't want to overload people with car horns and related to car horns, but that's the goal, right? So there's a continuum, right? So if you ask me what I'm interested in, I'm out there in the sense I'm looking at with something we call Hilbert space in quantum. It's the sum of all possible sounds relating, right, mathematically, and what we call the wave function. And I'm asking myself, how does that map into reality now in terms of sound and music composition and so on? And I'm not interested at all in. I'm interested. Behind me is a piano. I always have pianos and keyboards, but I'm no longer interested in normal tunings or anything like that. I'm just interested in a space where sounds happen, they relate, and your ears, because any sound can pop out of the field of the wave function at any time, not good or bad. So how do we adapt ourselves to what we know the universe is? And how can I make a composition? Xenakis did it, but he did it from a different perspective. And I want to use, in a way, numbers and math to create new sound possibilities. So that's what I'm working on. We call it sound journeys, but I'm getting more compositional now. Just not free improvisation. So I'm moving back into composition more. That's what I'm doing.
That's wonderful. Limitless possibilities.
Limitless. That's the
Limit.
whole point. Limitless. So and allowing ourselves to get out of the way and enjoy it, and allowing ourselves to deal with, we got stuff we got to deal with. So if we relate with it properly, that stuff is open. Literally, the stuff in our life is always opening us up to new possibilities.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. And if we relate with it that way, even if we can't deal with it, we can still go off into the fuzzy as a way of saying, I can't deal with it on one level, but I could on another. And then if you can't, if still after that you can't deal with it at all, you should go see a therapist, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
If
Yeah.
if you really get that far out with it, you're going to need help. Yeah.
Yeah. And in a way, there is some perfection in that approach. If we want to use that word, that there is nothing that's perfect and precise, but when everything's open, there is no limit, there is no
Well,
wrong sound.
I think that's what people like about sound baths and stuff like that. If they're done right, I've heard, if you can lay there at the introductory language of going in, if it's done correctly, the sound bath becomes you just travel, right? And because I always, when I'm doing tuning fork tune-ins, like human tune-ins and so on, I call them, I'm always saying, and I want you to be safe, I want you to lay down, are you open to new possibilities, creating new ways of seeing things, da 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 da. I use the fuzzy language, and if you are, could you just raise your hand, which is a hypnotic thing also, and people raise their hand, and I go, great, here we go, right? I don't need to know where you're traveling to, I just know that you're doing a search, so you can put new possibilities together in your life that will work for you in what's happening. And that's sound healing. I don't want to get involved in, if you want to get involved into specifics, someone says, I need to have sound healing for that. Well, they're located in a very boundary form space and trying to be transactional and get something to solve a problem. That's when you better be careful verbally how you're dealing with that. But this from a sound healing perspective, if you're laying there and have the right language, you just go off and you search.
In a way, it's liberating. I would say for the practitioner as well, as
Oh,
people learn protocols and techniques, it can get a bit fixed
yeah,
and we can get, am I doing it right? What's the next thing to do? So I think that approach um, could really be liberating.
no, it is liberating because you're looking for the right way to do it, always. And you're always afraid, and sound healing basically to work, that won't work. You need to come to terms with that and know what your boundaries are. But if you want to integrate sound healing into a professional practice, that's okay too. That's different. But you have to have mastered that practice to integrate it in. But if you're just doing sound healing by itself, it's not magical. It can be a discipline, and you have to know its limitations and its boundaries.
Well, wonderful. John, I really appreciate your time and I'm so looking forward to the class coming up. It's going to be a great
Fuzzy.
adventure, I can tell. It's going to be a great fuzzy adventure.
We'll be professionally fuzzy.
Perfect. Perfect. I think we all need a little bit more of that, don't we?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, we'll get more,
More than ever.
more than ever for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate you
You're
and I'll see you
welcome.
in class. All right. Thanks, John. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Sounds Heal Podcast, sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa. You can keep up to date with what's coming up next at soundshealstudio.com, on Instagram, Natalie Brown Sounds Heal, on Facebook, Sounds Heal Studio, and listen to meditations, music, and podcasts on the YouTube channel, Sounds Heal Studio. Thanks again for listening and for your support. Be well and stay tuned.